Ahoy, everyone. It's me, Ron Gabaldon, coming at you again from the loudest closet in Little Armenia. I've got another Kurt Vonnegut book for you here. This one I think everyone's going to like, and I'm going to run this one a little different. This one's a fundraiser of sorts for a charity, and the charity is this guy right here. His name is Meowmar Podoffi. He's a wonderful cat, and I love him. And he's great. He's very snuggly and cuddly. He purrs really loud, but he's got kidney disease. And it's very expensive to diagnose and treat a thing like kidney disease. And contrary to popular belief, audiobook narrators just don't make that much money. So I've set up a GoFundMe for him, Meowmar Podoffi, right here. And I'll put that link down below in the description. Along with links to my other audiobooks on Audible. Daffodil, Death Gets a Book, A Death in Toledo, Cat Coin. I've mentioned them over and over again, so you should know them by now. I know you're squirrely, aren't you? But if you could, any amount helps, and I'd really appreciate it. It takes a lot of work to put these books out, these Kurt Vonnegut audiobooks out. And it takes me about 6 hours to put out one finished hour of audio. I don't just read them all the way through. It's a whole editing and recording process, and it takes a lot. And I appreciate anything that you can give to help defray the costs of keeping Meowmar alive here, because I really, really love him. Otherwise, enjoy Deadeye Dick. Okay. All right. Yeah, wow. There you go. Deadeye Dick by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 1. Preface through Chapter 8. Read by Ron Gabaldon. And Meowmar. Preface. Deadeye Dick, like Barnacle Bill, is a nickname for a sailor. A deadeye is a rounded wooden block, usually bound with rope or iron and pierced with holes. The holes receive a multiplicity of lines, usually shrouds or stays in an old-fashioned sailing ship. But in the American Middle West of my youth, Deadeye Dick was an honorific often accorded to a person who was a virtuoso with firearms. So it is sort of a lungfish of a name. It was born in the ocean, but it adapted to life ashore. There are several recipes in this book, which are intended as musical interludes for the salivary glands. They have been inspired by James Beard's American Cookery, Marcella Hazan's The Classic Italian Cookbook, and B. Sandler's The African Cookbook. I have tinkered with the originals, however, so no one should use this novel for a cookbook. Any serious cook should have the reliable originals in his or her library anyway. There is a real hotel in this book, the Grand Hotel Olofsson in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. I love it, and so would almost anybody else. My dear wife Jill Cremens and I have stayed there in the so-called James Jones Cottage, which was built as an operating room when the hotel was headquarters for a brigade of United States Marines, who occupied Haiti in order to protect American financial interests there from 1915 until 1934. The exterior of that austere wooden box has subsequently been decorated with fanciful jigsaw gingerbread, like the rest of the hotel. The currency of Haiti, by the way, is based on the American dollar. Whatever an American dollar is worth, that is what a Haitian dollar is worth, and actual American dollars are in general circulation. There seems to be no scheme in Haiti, however, for retiring worn-out dollar bills and replacing them with new ones. So it is ordinary there to treat with utmost seriousness a dollar which is as insubstantial as a cigarette paper, and which has shrunk to the size of an airmail stamp. I found one such bill in my wallet when I got home from Haiti a couple of years ago, and I mailed it back to Al and Sue Seitz, the owners and hostess of the Olofsson, asking them to release it into its natural environment. It could never have survived a day in New York City. James Jones, 1921 to 1977, the American novelist, was actually married to his wife Gloria in the James Jones cottage before it was called that. So it is a literary honor to stay there. There is supposedly a ghost, not of James Jones, but of somebody else. We never saw it. Those who have seen it describe a young white man in a white jacket, possibly a medical orderly of some kind. There are only two doors, a back door opening into the main hotel, and the front door opening onto a porch. This ghost is said to follow the same route every time it appears. It comes in through the back door, searches for something in a piece of furniture which isn't there anymore, and then goes out the front door. It vanishes when it passes through the front door. It has never been seen in the main hotel or on the porch. It may have an uneasy conscience about something it did or saw done when the cottage was an operating room. There are 4 real painters in this book, 1 living and 3 dead. The living one is my friend in Athens, Ohio, Cliff McCarthy. The dead ones are John Rettig, Frank Duveneck, and Adolf Hitler. Cliff McCarthy is about my age and from my part of America, more or less. When he went to art school, it was drummed into him that the worst sort of painter was eclectic, borrowing from here and there. But now he has had a show of 30 years of his work at Ohio University, and he says, "I notice that I have been eclectic." It's strong and lovely stuff he does. My own favorite is The Artist's Mother as a Bride in 1917. His mother is all dressed up, and it's a warm time of year, and somebody has persuaded her to pose in the bow of a rowboat. The rowboat is in a perfectly still, narrow patch of water, a little river probably, with the opposite bank all leafy only 50 yards away. She is laughing. There really was a John Rettig, and his painting in the Cincinnati Art Museum, Crucifixion in Rome, is as I have described it. There really was a Frank Duveneck, and I in fact own a painting by him, Head of a Young Boy. It is a treasure left to me by my father. I used to think it was a portrait of my brother Bernard. It looks so much like him. And there really was an Adolf Hitler, who studied art in Vienna before the First World War, and whose finest picture may in fact have been the Minorite Church of Vienna. I will explain the main symbols in this book. There is an unappreciated empty art center in the shape of a sphere. This is my head as my 60th birthday beckons to me. There is a neutron bomb explosion in a populated area. This is the disappearance of so many people I cared about in Indianapolis when I was starting out to be a writer. Indianapolis is there, but the people are gone. Haiti is New York City, where I live now. The neutered pharmacist who tells the tale is my declining sexuality. The crime he committed in childhood is all the bad things I have done. This is fiction, not history, so it should not be used as a reference book. I say, for example, that the United States ambassador to Austria-Hungary at the outbreak of the First World War was Henry Close of Ohio. The actual ambassador at that time was Frederick Cortland Penfield of Connecticut. I also say that a neutron bomb is a sort of magic wand which kills people instantly but which leaves their property unharmed. This is a fantasy borrowed from enthusiasts for a Third World War. A real neutron bomb, detonated in a populated area, would cause a lot more suffering and destruction than I have described. I have also misrepresented Creole, just as the Viewpoint character, Rudy Waltz, learning that French dialect might do. I say that it has only one tense, the present. Creole only seems to have that one tense to a beginner, especially if those speaking it to him know that the present tense is the easiest tense for him. Peace. K.V. Who is Celia? What is she? That all her swains commend her. Otto Waltz, 1892 to 1960. 1. To the as yet unborn. To all innocent wisps of undifferentiated nothingness. Watch out for life. I have caught life. I have come down with life. I was a wisp of undifferentiated nothingness, and then a little peephole opened quite suddenly. Light and sound poured in. Voices began to describe me and my surroundings. Nothing they said could be appealed. They said I was a boy named Rudy Waltz, and that was that. They said the year was 1932, and that was that. They said I was in Midland City, Ohio, and that was that. They never shut up. Year after year they piled detail upon detail. They do it still. You know what they say now? They say the year is 1982, and that I am 50 years old. Blah, blah, blah. My father was Otto Waltz, whose peephole opened in 1892, and he was told, among other things, that he was the heir to a fortune earned principally by a quack medicine known as St. Elmo's Remedy. It was grain alcohol dyed purple, flavored with cloves and sarsaparilla root, and laced with opium and cocaine. As the joke goes, it was absolutely harmless unless discontinued. He, too, was a Midland City native. He was an only child, and his mother, on the basis of almost no evidence whatsoever, concluded that he could be another Leonardo da Vinci. She had a studio built for him on a loft of the carriage house behind the family mansion when he was only 10 years old, and she hired a rapscallion German cabinet maker who had studied art in Berlin in his youth to give father drawing and painting lessons on weekends and after school. It was a sweet racket for both teacher and pupil. The teacher's name was August Gunther, and his peephole must have opened in Germany around 1850. Teaching paid as well as cabinet making, and unlike cabinet making, allowed him to be as drunk as he pleased. After father's voice changed, moreover, Gunther could take him on overnight visits by rail to Indianapolis and Cincinnati and Louisville and Cleveland and so on, ostensibly to visit galleries and painters' studios. The two of them also managed to get drunk and to become darlings of the fanciest whorehouses in the Middle West. Was either one of them about to acknowledge that father couldn't paint or draw for sour apples? Who else was there to detect the fraud? Nobody. There wasn't anybody else in Midland City who cared enough about art to notice if father was gifted or not. He might as well have been a scholar of Sanskrit, as far as the rest of the town was concerned. Midland City wasn't a Vienna or a Paris. It wasn't even a St. Louis or a Detroit. It was a Bucyrus. It was a Kokomo. Gunther's treachery was discovered, but too late. He and father were arrested in Chicago after doing considerable property damage in a whorehouse there, and father was found to have gonorrhea, and so on. But father was by then a fully committed 18-year-old good-time Charlie. Gunther was denounced and fired and blacklisted. Grandfather and grandmother Waltz were tremendously influential citizens thanks to St. Elmo's Remedy. They spread the word that nobody of quality in Midland City was ever to hire Gunther for cabinet work or any other sort of work ever again. Father was sent to relatives in Vienna to have his gonorrhea treated and to enroll in the world-famous Academy of Fine Arts. While he was on the high seas in a first-class cabin aboard the Lusitania, his parents' mansion burned down. It was widely suspected that the showplace was torched by August Gunther, but no proof was found. Father's parents, rather than rebuild, took up residence in their 1,000-acre farm out near Shepherdstown, leaving behind the carriage house and a cellar hole. This was in 1910, 4 years before the outbreak of the First World War. So, Father presented himself at the Academy of Fine Arts with a portfolio of pictures he had created in Midland City. I myself have examined some of the artwork of his youth, which Mother used to moon over after he died. He was good at cross-hatching and shading a drapery, and August Gunther must have been capable in those areas too. But with few exceptions, everything Father depicted wound up looking as though it were made of cement. A cement woman in a cement dress, walking a cement dog, a herd of cement cattle, a cement bowl of cement fruit, set before a window with cement curtains, and so on. He was no good at catching likenesses either. He showed the Academy several portraits of his mother, and I have no idea what she looked like. Her peephole closed long before mine opened, but I do know that no two of Father's portraits of her resemble each other in the least. Father was told to come back to the Academy in 2 weeks, at which time they would tell him whether they would take him in or not. He was in rags at the time, with a piece of rope for a belt, and with patched trousers and so on, although he was receiving an enormous allowance from home. Vienna was then the capital of a great empire, and there were so many elaborate uniforms and exotic costumes, and so much wine and music that it seemed to Father to be a fancy dress ball. So he decided to come to the party as a starving artist. What fun! And he must have been very good looking then, for he was, in my opinion, the best looking man in Midland City when I got to know him a quarter of a century later. He was slender and erect to the end. He was 6 feet tall, his eyes were blue, he had curly golden hair, and he had lost almost none of it when his peephole closed, when he was allowed to stop being Otto Waltz, when he became just another wisp of undifferentiated nothingness again. So he came back in 2 weeks, and a professor handed him his portfolio, saying that his work was ludicrous. And there was another young man in rags there too, and he too had his portfolio returned with scorn. His name was Adolf Hitler. He was a native Austrian. He had come from Linz. And Father was so mad at the professor that he got his revenge right then and there. He asked to see some of Hitler's work, with the professor looking on. He picked a picture at random, and he said it was a brilliant piece of work, and he bought it from Hitler for more cash on the spot than the professor probably could earn in a month or more. Only an hour before, Hitler had sold his overcoat so that he could get a little something to eat, even though winter was coming on. So there is a chance that, if it weren't for my father, Hitler might have died of pneumonia or malnutrition in 1910. Father and Hitler paired off for a while, as people will, comforting and amusing each other, jeering at the art establishment which had rejected them, and so on. I know they took several long walking trips, just the two of them. I learned of their good times together from Mother. When I was old enough to be curious about Father's past, World War II was about to break out, and Father had developed lockjaw as far as his friendship with Hitler was concerned. Think of that. My father could have strangled the worst monster of the century, or simply let him starve or freeze to death. But he became his bosom buddy instead. That is my principal objection to life, I think. It is too easy, when alive, to make perfectly horrible mistakes. The painting my father bought from Hitler was a watercolor, which is now generally acknowledged as having been the best thing the monster ever did as a painter. And it hung for many years over my parents' bed in Midland City, Ohio. Its title was The Minorite Church of Vienna. 2. Father was so well received in Vienna, known to one and all as an American millionaire disguised as a ragged genius, that he roistered there for nearly 4 years. When the First World War broke out in August of 1914, he imagined that the fancy dress ball was to become a fancy dress picnic, that the party was to be moved out into the countryside, He was so happy, so naive, so self-enchanted, that he asked influential friends if they couldn't get him a commission in the Hungarian Life Guard, whose officers' uniforms included a panther skin. He adored that panther skin. He was summoned by the American ambassador to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Henry Claus, who was a Cleveland man and an acquaintance of Father's parents. Father was then 22 years old. Claus told Father that he would lose his American citizenship if he joined a foreign army, and that he had made inquiries about Father, and had learned that Father was not the painter he pretended to be, and that Father had been spending money like a drunken sailor, and that he had written to Father's parents telling them that their son had lost all touch with reality, and that it was time Father was summoned home and given some honest work to do. "What if I refuse?" said Father. "Your parents have agreed to stop your allowance," said Claus. So Father went home. I do not believe he would have stayed in Midland City if it weren't for what remained of his childhood home, which was its fanciful carriage house. It was hexagonal. It was stone. It had a conical slate roof. It had a naked skeleton inside of noble oak beams. It was a little piece of Europe in southwestern Ohio. It was a present from my great-grandfather Waltz to his homesick wife from Hamburg. It was a stone-by-stone replica of a structure in an illustration in her favorite book of German fairy tales. It still stands. I once showed it to an art historian from Ohio University, which is in Athens, Ohio. He said that the original might have been a medieval granary built on the ruins of a Roman watchtower from the time of Julius Caesar. Caesar was murdered 2,000 years ago. Think of that. I do not think my father was entirely ungifted as an artist. Like his friend Hitler, he had a flair for romantic architecture. And he set about transforming the carriage house into a painter's studio fit for the reincarnated Leonardo da Vinci his doting mother still believed him to be. Father's mother was as crazy as a bedbug, my own mother said. I sometimes think that I would have had a very different sort of soul if I had grown up in an ordinary little American house, if our home had not been vast. Father got rid of all the horse-drawn vehicles in the carriage house. A sleigh, a buckboard, a surrey, a phaeton, a brougham, and who knows what all. Then he had 10 horse stalls and a tack room ripped out. This gave him, for his private enjoyment, more uninterrupted floor space beneath a far higher ceiling than was afforded by any house of worship or public building in the Midland City of that time. Was it big enough for a basketball game? A basketball court is 94 feet long and 50 feet wide. My childhood home was only 80 feet in diameter. So no, it lacked 14 feet of being big enough for a basketball game. There were 2 pairs of enormous doors in the carriage house, wide enough to admit a carriage and a team of horses. 1 pair faced north, 1 pair faced south. Father had his workmen take down the northern pair, which his old mentor, August Gunther, made into 2 tables, a dining table and a table on which Father's paints and brushes and palette knives and charcoal sticks and so on were to be displayed. The doorway was then filled with what remains the largest window in the city, admitting copious quantities of that balm for all great painters, northern light. It was before this window that Father's easel stood. Yes, he had been reunited with the disreputable August Gunther, who must have been in his middle 60s then. Old Gunther had only 1 child, a daughter named Grace, so Father was like a son to him. A more suitable son for Gunther would be hard to imagine. Mother was just a little girl then, and living in a mansion next door. She was terrified of old Gunther. She told me one time that all nice little girls were supposed to run away from him. Right up until the time Mother died, she cringed if August Gunther was mentioned. He was a hobgoblin to her. He was the bogeyman. As for the pair of great doors facing south, Father had them bolted shut and padlocked, and the workmen caulked the cracks between and around them to keep out the wind. And then August Gunther cut a front door into one of them. That was the entrance to Father's studio, what would later be my childhood home. A hexagonal loft encircled and overhung the great chamber. This was partitioned off into bedrooms and bathrooms and a small library. Above that was an attic under the conical slate roof. Father had no immediate use for the attic, so it was left in its primitive condition. It was all so impractical, which I guess was the whole idea. Father was so elated by the vastness of the ground floor, which was paved with cobblestones laid in sand, that he considered putting the kitchen up on a loft. But that would have put the servants and all their hustle and bustle and cooking smells up among the bedrooms. There was no basement to put them in. So he reluctantly put the kitchen on the ground floor, tucked under a loft and partitioned off with old boards. It was cramped and stuffy. I would love it. I would feel so safe and cozy in there. Many people found our house spooky, and the attic in fact was full of evil when I was born. It housed a collection of more than 300 antique and modern firearms. Father had bought them during his and Mother's 6-month honeymoon in Europe in 1922. Father thought them beautiful, but they might as well have been copperheads and rattlesnakes. They were murder. 3. My mother's peephole opened in Midland City in 1901. She was 9 years younger than Father. She, like him, was an only child, the daughter of Richard Wetzel, the founder and principal stockholder of the Midland City National Bank. Her name was Emma. She was born into a mansion teeming with servants, right next to my father's childhood home. But she would die penniless in 1978, 4 years ago now, in a little shitbox she and I shared in the suburb of Midland City called Avondale. She remembered seeing Father's childhood home burn down when she was 9 years old, when Father was on his way to Vienna. But Father made a far greater impression on her than the fire when he came home from Vienna and looked over the carriage house with the idea of turning it into a studio. She had her first glimpse of him through the privet hedge between the two properties. This was a bird-legged, buck-toothed, skinny 13-year-old who had never seen men dressed in anything but overalls or business suits. Her parents had spoken glowingly of Father since he was rich and came from an excellent family. They had suggested playfully that she could do worse than marry him someday. So now she peeked at him through the hedge, her heart beating madly, and great God! He was all scarlet and silver, except for a panther skin over one shoulder, and a sable busby with a purple plume on his head. He was wearing one of the many souvenirs he had brought home from Vienna, which was the dress uniform of a major in the Hungarian Life Guard, the regiment he had hoped to join. A real Hungarian Life Guard back in the Austro-Hungarian Empire might have been putting on a field gray uniform about then. Father's friend Hitler, who was an Austrian, had managed to join the German rather than the Austrian army, because he admired all things German so much. He was wearing field gray. Father was living with his parents out near Shepherdstown at the time, but all his souvenirs were stored in the carriage house. And on the day that Mother saw him in the uniform, he had begun opening trunks and packing cases, with his old mentor, August Gunther, looking on. He had put on the uniform to make Gunther laugh. They came outside, lugging a table between them. They were going to have lunch in the shade of an ancient walnut tree. They had brought beer and bread and sausage and cheese and roast chicken, all of which had been produced locally. The cheese, incidentally, was Liederkranz, which most people assume is a European cheese. Liederkranz was invented in Midland City, Ohio, in about 1865. So Father, sitting down for a lusty lunch with old Gunther, was aware that a little girl was watching everything through the hedge, and he made jokes about her which she could hear. He said to Gunther that he had been away so long that he could no longer remember the names of American birds. There was a bird in the hedge there, he said, and he described Mother as though she were a bird. And he asked old Gunther what to call the bird. And Father approached the supposed little bird with a piece of bread in his hand, asking if little birds like her ate bread. And Mother fled into her parents' house. She told me this. Father told me this. But she came out again, and she found a better place to spy from, where she could see without being seen. There were puzzling new arrivals at the picnic. There were two short, dark youths, who had evidently been wading. They were barefoot, and their trousers were wet above the knees. Mother had never seen anything quite like them for this reason. The two, who were brothers, were Italians, and there had never been Italians in Midland City before. They were Gino Maritimo, 18, and Marco Maritimo, 20. They were in one hell of a lot of trouble. They weren't expected at the picnic. They weren't even supposed to be in the United States. 36 hours before, they had been stokers aboard an Italian freighter which was taking on cargo in Newport News, Virginia. They had jumped ship in order to escape military conscription at home, and because the streets of America were paved with gold. They spoke no English. Other Italians in Newport News boosted them and their cardboard suitcases into an empty boxcar in a train that was bound for God knows where. The train began to move immediately. The sun went down. There were no stars, no moon that night. America was blackness and clackety-clack. How do I know what the night was like? Gino and Marco Maritimo, as old men, both told me so. Somewhere in the seamless darkness, which may have been West Virginia, Gino and Marco were joined by 4 American hobos, who at knife point took their suitcases, their coats, their hats, and their shoes. They were lucky they didn't have their throats slit for fun. Who would have cared? How they wished that their peepholes would close. But the nightmare went on, and then it became a daymare. The train stopped several times, but in the midst of such ugliness that Gino and Marco could not bring themselves to step out into it, to somehow start living there. But then 2 railroad detectives with long clubs made them get out anyway, and, like it or lump it, they were on the outskirts of Midland City, Ohio, on the other side of Sugar Creek from the center of town. They were terribly hungry and thirsty. They could either await death, or they could invent something to do. They invented. They saw a conical slate roof on the other side of the river, and they walked toward that. In order to keep putting one foot in front of the other, they pretended that it was of utmost importance that they reach that structure, and no other. They waded across Sugar Creek, rather than draw attention to themselves on the bridge. They would have swum the creek if it had been that deep. And now, here they were, as astonished as my mother had been to see a young man all dressed in scarlet and silver, with a sable busby on his head. When Father looked askance at the 2 of them from his seat under the oak, Gino, the younger of the brothers, but their leader, said in Italian that they were hungry and would do any sort of work for food. Father replied in Italian. He was good with languages. He was fluent in French and German and Spanish, too. He told the brothers that they should by all means sit down and eat, if they were as hungry as they appeared to be. He said that nobody should ever be hungry. He was like a god to them. It was so easy for him to be like a god to them. After they had eaten, he took them up into the attic above the loft, the future gun room. There were 2 old cots up there. Light and air came from windows in a cupola at the peak of the roof. A ladder, its bottom bolted to the center of the attic floor, led up into the cupola. Father told the brothers that they could make the attic their home until they found something better. He said he had some old shoes and sweaters and so on, if they wanted them, in his trunks below. He put them to work the next day, ripping out the stalls and tack room. And no matter how rich and powerful the Maritimo brothers subsequently became, and no matter how disreputable and poor Father became, Father remained a god to them. 4. And somewhere in there, before America entered the First World War against the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, Father's parents had their peepholes closed by carbon monoxide from a faulty heating system in their farmhouse out near Shepherdstown. So Father became a major stockholder in the family business, the Waltz Brothers Drug Company, to which he had contributed nothing but ridicule and scorn. And he attended stockholders' meetings in a beret and a paint-stained smock and sandals, and he brought old August Gunther along, claiming Gunther was his lawyer. And he protested that he found his 2 uncles and their several sons, who actually ran the business, intolerably humorless and provincial and obsessed by profits and so on. He would ask them when they were going to stop poisoning their fellow citizens and so on. At that time, the uncles and cousins were starting the first chain of drugstores in the history of the country, and they were especially proud of the soda fountains in these stores, and had spent a lot of money to guarantee that the ice cream served at those fountains was the equal of any ice cream in the world. So Father wanted to know why ice cream at a Waltz Brothers drugstore always tasted like library paste, and so on. He was an artist, you see, interested in enterprises far loftier than mere pharmacy. And now is perhaps the time for me to name my own profession. Guess what? I, Rudy Waltz, the son of the great artist Otto Waltz, am a registered pharmacist. Somewhere in there, one end of a noble oak timber was dropped on Father's left foot. Alcohol was involved in the accident. During a wild party at the studio, with tools and building materials lying all around, Father got a structural idea which had to be carried out at once. Nothing would do but that the drunken guests become common laborers under Father's command, and a young dairy farmer named John Fortune lost his grip on a timber. It fell on Father's foot, smashing the bones of his instep. 2 of his toes died and had to be cut away. Thus was Father rendered unfit for military service when America got into World War I. Father once said to me when he was an old man, after he had spent 2 years in prison, after he and Mother had lost all their money and art treasures in a lawsuit, that his greatest disappointment in life was that he had never been a soldier. That was almost the last illusion he had, and there might have been some substance to it, that he had been born to serve bravely and resourcefully on a battlefield. He certainly envied John Fortune to the end. The man who crushed his foot went on to become a hero in the trenches of the First World War, and Father would have liked to have fought beside him, and, like Fortune, come home with medals on his chest. The only remotely military honor Father would ever receive was a citation from the governor of Ohio for Father's leadership of scrap drives in Midland County during World War II. There was no ceremony. The certificate simply arrived in the mail one day. Father was in prison over at Shepherdstown when it came. Mother and I brought it to him on Visitor's Day. I was 13 then. It would have been kinder for us to burn it up and scatter its ashes over Sugar Creek. That certificate was the crowning irony as far as Father was concerned. "At last, I have joined the company of the immortals," he said. "There are only 2 more honors for me to covet now." One was to be a licensed dog. The other was to be a notary public. And Father made us hand over the certificate so that he could wipe his behind with it at the earliest opportunity, which he surely did. Instead of saying goodbye that day, he said this, a finger in the air: "Nature calls." And somewhere in there, in the autumn of 1916 to be exact, The old rascal August Gunther died under most mysterious circumstances. He got up 2 hours before dawn one day and prepared and ate a hearty breakfast while his wife and daughter slept. He set out on foot armed with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun which my father had given to him, meaning to join Father and John Fortune and some other young bucks in gun pits on the edge of a meadow on John Fortune's father's dairy farm. They were going to shoot geese which had spent the night on the backwaters of Sugar Creek and on Crystal Lake. The meadow had been baited with cracked corn. He never reached the gun pits, or so the story went, so he must have died somewhere in the intervening 5 miles, which included the Sugar Creek Bridge. 1 month later, the headless body was found at the mouth of Sugar Creek, just west of Cincinnati, about to start its voyage to the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico and beyond. What a vacation from Midland City! And when I was little, the decapitation of August Gunther, so long ago, 16 years before my birth, was the most legendary of all unsolved crimes committed in my hometown. And I had a ghoulish ambition. I imagined that I would be famous and admired, if only I could find August Gunther's missing head. And after that, the murderer would have to confess, for some reason, and he would be taken off to be punished, and so on, and the mayor would pin a medal on me. Little did I suspect back then that I myself, Rudy Waltz, would become a notorious murderer known as Deadeye Dick. My parents were married in 1922, 4 years after the end of the First World War. Father was 30 and Mother was 21. Mother was a college graduate, having taken a liberal arts degree at Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. Father, who certainly encouraged people to believe that he had spent time at some great and ancient European university, was in fact only a high school graduate. He could certainly lecture on history or race or biology or art or politics for hours, although he had read very little. Almost all his opinions and information were cannibalized from the educations and miseducations of his roistering companions in Vienna before the First World War. And one of these pals was Hitler, of course. The wedding and the reception took place in the Wetzel Mansion, next door to the studio. The Wetzels and the Waltzes were proudly agnostic, so the ceremony was performed by a judge. Father's best man was John Fortune, the war hero and dairy farmer. Mother's attendants were friends from Oberlin. Father's immediate relatives, the uncles and cousins who earned his living for him, came with their mates to the wedding, but they stayed only for a few minutes of the reception, behaving correctly but coldly, and then they departed en masse. Father had given them every reason to loathe him. Father laughed. According to Mother, he announced to the rest of the guests that he was sorry, but that his relatives had to go back to the counting house. He was quite the bohemian. So then he and Mother went on a 6-month honeymoon in Europe. While they were away, the Waltz Brothers Drug Company was moved to Chicago, where it had already had a cosmetics factory and 3 drugstores. When Mother and Father came home, they were the only Waltzes in town. It was during the honeymoon that Father acquired his famous gun collection, or most of it, at a single whack. He and Mother had visited what was left of the family of a friend from the good old days in Vienna, Rudolf von Furstenberg, outside of Salzburg, Austria. Rudolf had been killed in the war, and so had his father and 2 brothers, and I am named after him. His mother and his youngest brother survived, but they were bankrupt. Everything on the estate was for sale. So Father bought the collection of more than 300 guns, which encompassed almost the entire history of firearms up until 1914 or so. Several of the weapons were American, including a Colt .45 revolver and a .30-06 Springfield rifle. As powerful as those two guns were, Father taught me how to fire them and handle their violent kicks, and to clean them, and to take them apart and put them back together while blindfolded, when I was only 10 years old. God bless him. And Mother and Father bought a lot of the von Furstenberg's furniture and linens and crystal and some battle axes and swords, chain maces and helmets and shields. My brother and I were both conceived in a von Furstenberg bed, with a coat of arms on the headboard and with The Minorite Church of Vienna by Adolf Hitler on the wall over that. Mother and Father went looking for Hitler too on their honeymoon, but he was in jail. He had risen to the rank of corporal in the war and had won an Iron Cross for delivering messages under fire. So Father had close friends who had been heroes on both sides of the war. Father and Mother also bought the enormous weather vane from the gatehouse of the von Furstenberg estate and put it atop their cupola back home, making the studio taller than anything in the county, except for the dome of the county courthouse, a few silos, the Fortune's Dairy Barn, and the Midland County National Bank. That weather vane was instantly the most famous work of art in Midland City. Its only competition was a statue of a Union soldier on foot in Fairchild Park. Its arrow alone was 12 feet long, and one hollow copper horseman chased another one down that awesome shaft. The one in back was an Austrian with a lance. The one in front, fleeing for his life, was a Turk with a scimitar. This engine, swinging now toward Detroit, now toward Louisville, and so on, commemorated the lifting of the Turkish siege of Vienna in 1683. When I was little, I asked my brother Felix, who is 7 years older than I am, and who used to lie to me every chance he got, to explain to me and a playmate the significance of the weather vane. He was in high school then. He already had the beautiful, deep purple voice which would prove to be his fortune in the communications industry. "If the Austrians hadn't won," he said in a solemn rumble, "Mother would be in a harem now. Father would be passing out towels in a steam bath, and you and I and your friend here would probably have our balls cut off." I believe him at the time. Ahoy, everyone, it's me again. Just want to do a little mid-break here, kind of a public radio fundraiser thing to remind everyone about the GoFundMe that I've got in the description, and probably put a thing here on the screen somewhere, just so that you know the link to go to help out Meowmar, my good buddy and a cat that I have loved and known for some time. Wonderful guy. He's got kidney problems, and he could really use your help. So please, if you could, just click on that link in the description, and however much you want, $5, $10, anything like that. It's just anything would help. So really appreciate it a bunch. And if you'd like a Nobody's Billboard t-shirt, because these don't exist anywhere else, I made these myself. There's a Redbubble link that I'm going to put in the description also, so you can have your very own Nobody's Billboard t-shirt and let everyone know that you don't stand for any brand. Awesome. And now back to Deadeye Dick. 5. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, when I was 1 year old. Father, who had not seen him since 1914, sent his heartiest congratulations and a gift, Hitler's watercolor, The Minorite Church of Vienna. Hitler was charmed. He had fond memories of Father, he said, and he invited him to come to Germany as his personal guest, to see the new social order he was building, which he expected to last 1,000 years or more. Mother and Father and Felix, who was then 9, went to Germany for 6 months in 1934, leaving me behind and in the care of servants, all black people. Why should I have gone? I was only 2. It was surely then that I formed the opinion that the servants were my closest relatives. I aspired to do what they did so well, to cook and bake and wash dishes, and to make the beds, and wash and iron, and spade the garden, and so on. It still makes me as happy as I can be to prepare a good meal in a house which, because of me, is sparkling clean. I have no conscious memory of what my real relatives looked like when they came home from Germany. Perhaps a hypnotist could help me come up with one, but I have since seen photographs of them in a scrapbook Mother kept of those exciting days, and also in old copies of the Midland City Bugle-Observer. Mother is wearing a dirndl. Father is wearing lederhosen and knee socks. Felix, although technically not entitled to do so, since he never joined the organization, was wearing the khaki uniform and Sam Browne belt and the armband with swastika and ornamental dagger of the Hitler Youth. Even if Felix had been a German boy, he would have been too young to wear an outfit like that. But Father had a tailor in Berlin make it up for him anyway. Why not? And as soon as those relatives of mine got home, according to the paper, Father flew his favorite gift from Hitler from the horizontal shaft of the weather vane. It was a Nazi flag as big as a bedsheet. Again, this was only 1934, and World War II was still a long way off. It was a long way off, that is, if 5 years can be considered a long way off. So flying a Nazi flag in Midland City was no more offensive than flying a Greek, or Irish, or Confederate flag, or whatever. It was a playful, exuberant thing to do, and according to Mother, the community was proud and envious of Father, and her, and Felix. Nobody else in Midland City was friendly with a head of state. I myself am in one picture in the paper. It is of our entire family in the street in front of the studio, looking up at the Nazi flag. I am in the arms of Mary Hubler, our cook. She would teach me everything she knew about cooking and baking by and by. Mary Hubler's cornbread. Mix together in a bowl half a cup of flour, 1½ cups of yellow cornmeal, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of sugar, and 3 teaspoons of baking powder. Add 3 beaten eggs, a cup of milk, a half cup of cream, and a half cup of melted butter. Pour it into a well-buttered pan and bake it at 400 degrees for 15 minutes. Cut it into little squares while it is hot. Bring the squares to the table while they are still hot and fold it in a napkin. When we all posed in the street for our picture in the paper, Father was 42. According to Mother, he had undergone a profound spiritual change in Germany. He had a new sense of purpose in life. It was no longer enough to be an artist. He would become a teacher and a political activist. He would become a spokesman in America for a new social order which was being born in Germany, but which in time would be the salvation of the world. This was quite a mistake. How to make Mary Hubler's barbecue sauce. Sauté a cup of chopped onions and 3 chopped garlic cloves in 1/4 pound of butter until tender. Add a half cup of ketchup, a 1/4 cup of brown sugar, a teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons of freshly ground pepper, a dash of Tabasco, a tablespoon of lemon juice, a teaspoon of basil, and a tablespoon of chili powder. Bring to a boil and simmer for 5 minutes. So, for 2 years and a little more, Father lectured and showed films and lantern slides of the new Germany all over the Middle West. He told heartwarming stories about his friend Hitler and explained Hitler's theories about the variously superior and inferior human races as being simple chemistry. A pure Jew was this, a pure German was that. Cross a Pole and a Negro, you were certain to get an amusing laborer. It must have been terrible. I remember the Nazi flag hanging on the wall of our living room, or I think I do. I certainly heard about it. It used to be the first thing that visitors saw when they came in. It was so colorful. Everything else was so dull by comparison. The timbers and stone walls, the great tables made of carriage house doors, Father's rustic easel, which looked like a guillotine, silhouetted against the north window, the medieval weapons and armor rusting here and there. I close my eyes and I try to see the flag in my memory. I can't. I shiver, though, because our house, except for the kitchen, was always so cold in the wintertime. That house was a perfect son of a bitch to heat. Father wanted to see bare stones of the walls and the bare boards that supported the slate roof over the gunroom. Even at the end of his life, when my brother Felix was paying the heating bill, Father would not hear of insulation. "After I am dead," he said. Mother and Father and Felix never used to complain about the cold. They wore lots of clothes in the house and said everybody else's house in America was too warm and that all the heat slowed the blood and made people lazy and stupid and so on. That, too, must have been part of the Nazi thing. They would make me come out of the little kitchen and into the vast draftiness of the rest of the ground floor so that I would grow up hardy and vigorous, I suppose. But I was soon back in the kitchen again, where it was so hot and fragrant. It was comical in there, too, since it was the only room in the house where any meaningful work was going on. And yet it was as cramped as a ship's galley. The people who did nothing, who were merely waited on, had all the space. And on cold days, and even on days that weren't all that cold, the rest of the servants, the yard man and the upstairs maid and so on, all black, would crowd into the kitchen with the cook and me. They liked being crowded together. When they were little, they told me they slept in beds with a whole lot of brothers and sisters. That sounded like a lot of fun to me. It still sounds like a lot of fun to me. There in that crowded kitchen, everybody would talk and talk and talk so easily, just blather and blather and laugh and laugh. I was included in the conversation. I was a nice little boy. Everybody liked me. "What do you got to say about that, Mr. Rudy?" a servant would ask me, and I would say something, anything, and everybody would pretend I had said something wise or intentionally funny. If I had died in childhood, I would have thought life was that little kitchen. I would have done anything to get back into that kitchen again, on the coldest day in wintertime. Carry me back to old Virginia. Somewhere in there, the Nazi flag came down. Father stopped traveling. According to my brother Felix, who was an 8th grader at the time, Father wouldn't even leave the house or talk on the telephone, or look at his mail for 3 months or more. He went into such a deep depression that it was feared that he might commit suicide, so that Mother took the gunroom key from his keyring. He never missed it. He had no inclination to visit his beloved firearms. Felix says that Father might have crashed like that no matter what was going on in the outside world, but the mail and telephone calls he was receiving were getting meaner all the time, and G-men had visited him and suggested that he register as an agent for a foreign power in order to comply with the law of the land. The man who had been his best man at his wedding, John Fortune, had stopped speaking to him and had been going around town, to Father's certain knowledge, declaring Father to be a dangerous nincompoop. Which Father surely was. Fortune himself was of totally Germanic extraction. His last name was simply an angelicization of the German word for luck, which is Glück. Fortune would never give Father an opportunity to mend the rupture between them, for in 1938 he suddenly took off for the Himalayas in search of far higher happiness and wisdom than was available evidently in Midland City, Ohio. His wife had died of cancer. He was childless. There had been some defect in his or his wife's reproductive apparatus. The family dairy farm went bankrupt and was taken over by the Midland County National Bank. And John Fortune is buried now in bib overalls in the capital city of Nepal, which is Kathmandu. 6. Midland City has now been depopulated by a neutron bomb explosion. It was a big news story for about 10 days or so. It might have been a bigger story, a signal for the start of World War III, if the government hadn't acknowledged at once that the bomb was made in America. One newscast I heard down here in Haiti called it a friendly bomb. The official story is that an American truck was transporting this American bomb on the interstate, and the bomb went off. There was this flash. It was an accident, supposedly. The truck, if there really was a truck, seems to have been right opposite the new Holiday Inn and Dwayne Hoover's Exit 11 Pontiac Village when the bomb went off. Everybody in the county was killed, including 5 people awaiting execution on death row in the adult correctional institution at Shepherdstown. I certainly lost a lot of acquaintances all at once. But most of the structures are still left standing and furnished. I am told that every one of the television sets in the new Holiday Inn is still fully operable. So are all the telephones. So is the ice cube maker behind the bar. All those sensitive devices were only a few hundred yards from the source of the flash. So nobody lives in Midland City, Ohio anymore. About 100,000 people died. That was roughly the population of Athens during the golden age of Pericles. That is 2/3 of the population of Kathmandu. And I do not see how I can get out of asking this question. Does it matter to anyone or anything that all these peepholes were closed so suddenly? Since all the property is undamaged, has the world lost anything it loved? Midland City isn't radioactive. New people could move right in. There is talk now of turning it over to Haitian refugees. Good luck to them. There is an arts center there. If the neutrons were going to knock over anything, you might think, it would have been the Mildred Berry Center for the Arts, since it looks so frail and exposed. A white sphere on 4 slender stilts in the middle of Sugar Creek. It has never been used. The walls of its galleries are bare. What a delightful opportunity it would represent to Haitians, who are the most prolific painters and sculptors in the history of the world. The most gifted Haitian could refurbish my father's studio. It is time a real artist lived there, with all that north light flooding in. Haitians speak Creole, a French dialect which has only a present tense. I have lived in Haiti with my brother for the past 6 months, so I can speak it some. Felix and I are innkeepers now. We have bought the Grand Hotel Olofsen, a gingerbread palace at the base of a cliff in Port-au-Prince. Imagine a language with only a present tense. Our head waiter, Hippolyte Paul DeMille, who claims to be 80 and have 59 descendants, asked me about my father. "He is dead?" he said in Creole. "He is dead," I agreed. There could be no argument about that. "What does he do?" he said. "He paints," I said. "I like him," he said. Haitian fresh fish in coconut cream. Put 2 cups of grated coconut in cheesecloth over a bowl. Pour a cup of hot milk over it and squeeze it dry. Repeat this with 2 more cups of hot milk. The stuff in the bowl is the sauce. Mix a pound of sliced onions, a teaspoon of salt, a half teaspoon of black pepper, and a teaspoon of crushed pepper. Sauté the mixture in butter until soft, but not brown. Add 4 pounds of fresh fish chunks and cook them for about a minute on each side. Pour the sauce over the fish, cover the pan, and simmer for 10 minutes. Uncover the pan and baste the fish until it is done, and the sauce has become creamy. Serves 8 vaguely disgruntled guests at the Grand Hotel Olofsen. Imagine a language with only a present tense. Or imagine my father, who was wholly a creature of the past. To all practical purposes, he spent most of his adult life, except for the last 15 years, at a table in a Viennese cafe before the First World War. He was forever 20 years old or so. He would paint wonderful pictures by and by. He would be a devil-may-care soldier by and by. He was already a lover and a philosopher and a nobleman. I don't think he even noticed Midland City before I became a murderer. It was as though he were in a spacesuit with the atmosphere of pre-war Vienna inside. He used to speak so inappropriately to my playmates and to Felix's friends whenever we were foolish enough to bring them home. At least I didn't go through what Felix went through when he was in junior high school. Back then, Father used to say Heil Hitler to Felix's guests, and they were expected to say Heil Hitler back. And it was all supposed to be such lusty fun.
My God,
Felix said only the other afternoon.
It was bad enough that we were the richest kids in town, and everybody else was having such a hard time. And there was all this rusty medieval shit hanging on the walls, as though it were a torture chamber. Couldn't we at least have had a father who didn't say Heil Hitler to everyone, including Izzy Finkelstein? About how much money we had, even though the Great Depression was going on. Father sold off all his Waltz Brothers Drug Company stock in the 1920s, so when the chain fell apart during the Depression, it meant nothing to him. He bought Coca-Cola stock, which acted the way he did, as though it didn't even know a depression was going on. And Mother still had all the bank stock she had inherited from her father. Because of all the prime farmland it had acquired through foreclosures, it was as good as gold. This was dumb luck. It was soda fountains as much as the Depression that wrecked the Waltz Brothers chain. Pharmacists have no business being in the food business, too. Leave the food business to those who know and love it. One of Father's favorite jokes, I remember, was about the boy who flunked out of pharmacy school. He didn't know how to make a club sandwich. There is still one Waltz Brothers drugstore left, I have heard, in Cairo, Illinois. It certainly has nothing to do with me or with any of my relatives, wherever they may be. I gather that it is part of a cute, old-fashioned urban renewal scheme in downtown Cairo. The streets are cobblestoned, like the floor of my childhood home. The streetlights are gas. And there is an old-fashioned pool hall, and an old-fashioned saloon, and an old-fashioned firehouse, and an old-fashioned drugstore with a soda fountain. Somebody found an old sign from a Waltz Brothers drugstore, and they hung it up again. It was so quaint. I hear they have a poster inside, too, which sings the praises of St. Elmo's Remedy. They wouldn't dare really stock St. Elmo's Remedy today, of course. It was so bad for people. The poster is just a joke. But they have a modern prescription counter where you can get barbiturates, and amphetamines, and methaqualones, and so on. Science marches on. By the time I was old enough to bring guests home, Father had stopped mentioning Hitler to anyone. That much about the present had got through to him anyway. The subject of Hitler and the New Order in Germany seemed to make people angrier with each passing day, so he had better find something else to talk about. And I do not mean to mock him. He had been just another wisp of undifferentiated nothingness, like the rest of us. And then all the light and sound poured in. But he assumed that my playmates were thoroughly familiar with Greek mythology and legends of King Arthur's Round Table and the plays of Shakespeare and Cervantes' Don Quixote, Goethe's Faust and Wagnerian opera, and on, all of which were no doubt lively subjects in Viennese cafes before the First World War. So he might say to the 8-year-old son of a tool checker over at Green Diamond Plow, "You look at me as though I were Mephistopheles. Is that who you think I am? Eh? Eh?" My guest was expected to answer. Or he might say to a daughter of a janitor over at the YMCA, offering her a chair, "Do sit down in the Siege Perilous, my dear. Or do you dare?"
Almost all my playmates were children of uneducated parents in humble jobs, since the neighborhood had gone downhill fast after all the rich people but father and mother moved away. Father might say to another one,
I am Daedalus. Would you like me to give you wings so that you can fly with me? We can join the geese and fly south with them. But we mustn't fly too close to the sun, must we? Why mustn't we fly too close to the sun, eh? Eh?
And the child was expected to answer. On his deathbed at the county hospital, when Father was listing all his virtues and vices, he said that at least he had been wonderful with children, that they had all found him a lot of fun.
I understand them,
he said. He gave his most dumbfoundingly inappropriate greeting, however, not to a child, but to a young woman named Celia Hildreth. She was a high school senior, as was my brother, and Felix had invited her to the senior prom. This would have been in the springtime of 1943, almost exactly a year before I became a murderer. A double murderer, actually. World War II was going on. Felix was the president of his class because of that deep voice of his. God spoke through him about where the senior prom should be held and whether people should have their nicknames under their pictures in the yearbook, and on and on. And he was in the midst of an erotic catastrophe to which he had made me privy, although I was only 11 years old. Irreconcilable differences had arisen between him and his sweetheart for the past semester and a half, Sally Freeman, and Sally had turned to Steve Adams, the captain of the basketball team, for consolation. This left the president of the class without a date for the prom, and at a time when every girl of any social importance had been spoken for. Felix executed a sociological masterstroke. He invited a girl who was at the bottom of the social order, whose parents were illiterate and unemployed, who had 2 brothers in prison, who got very poor grades, and engaged in no extracurricular activities, but who, nonetheless, was one of the prettiest young women anybody had ever seen. Her family was white, but they were so poor that they lived in the black part of town. Also, the few young men who had tried to trifle with her, despite her social class, had spread the word that, no matter what she looked like, she was as cold as ice. This was Celia Hildreth. So she could have had scant expectation of being invited to the senior prom. But miracles do happen. A new Cinderella is born every minute. One of the richest, cutest boys in town, and the president of the senior class no less, invited her to the senior prom. So, a few weeks in advance of the prom, Felix talked a lot about how beautiful Celia Hildreth was, and what an impression he was going to make when he appeared with a movie star on his arm. Everybody else there was supposed to feel like a fool for having ignored Celia for so long. And Father heard all this, and nothing would do but that Felix bring Celia by the studio on the way to prom so that Father, an artist after all, could see for himself if Celia was as beautiful as Felix said. Felix and I had by then given up bringing home friends for any reason whatsoever. But in this instance, Father had a means for compelling Felix to introduce him to Celia. If Felix wouldn't do that, then Felix couldn't use the car that night. He and Celia would have to ride a bus to the senior prom. Haitian banana soup. Stew 2 pounds of goat or chicken with a half cup of chopped onions, a teaspoon of salt, half a teaspoon of black pepper, and a pinch of crushed red pepper. Use 2 quarts of water. Stew for an hour. Add 3 peeled yams and 3 peeled bananas, cut into chunks. Simmer until the meat is tender. Take out the meat. What is left is 8 servings of Haitian banana soup. Bon appetit! So Father, without enough to do, as usual, was as excited by the approach of prom night as the most bubble-headed senior. He would say over and over, "Who is Celia?
What is she, that all her swains commend her?
Or he would protest in the middle of a silence at supper,
She can't be that beautiful. No girl could be that beautiful.
It was to no avail for Felix to tell him that Celia was no world's champion of feminine pulchritude. Felix said many times,
She's just the prettiest girl in the senior class, Dad.
But Father imagined a grander adversary. He, the highest judge of beauty in the city, and Celia, one of the most beautiful women ever to live, supposedly, were about to meet eye to eye. Oh, he was leading scrap drives in those days, and he was an air warden, too. And he had helped the War Department to draw up a personality profile of Hitler, who he now said was a brilliant homicidal maniac. But he still felt drab and superannuated and so on, with so many battle reports in the paper and on the radio, and with so many uniforms around. His spirits needed a boost in the very worst way. And he had a secret. If Felix had guessed it, Felix wouldn't have brought Celia within a mile of home. He would have taken her to the prom on a bus. This was it. When Celia was introduced to Father, he would be wearing the scarlet and silver uniform of a major in the Hungarian Life Guard, complete with sable busby and panther skin. 7. Listen. When Felix was ready to fetch Celia, Father wasn't even in his painter's costume. He was wearing a sweater and slacks, and he promised Felix yet again that he simply wanted to catch a glimpse of this girl, and that he wasn't going to put on any kind of a show for her. It was all going to be very ordinary and brief, and even boring. About the automobile. It was a Kienzler touring car, manufactured right in Midland City in 1932, when a Kienzler was in every respect the equal or the superior of a German Mercedes or a British Rolls-Royce. It was a bizarre and glorious antique, even in 1943. Felix had put the top down. There was a separate windshield for the back seat. The engine had 16 cylinders, and the 2 spare tires were mounted in shallow wells in the front fenders. The tires looked like the necks of plunging horses. So Felix burbled off toward the black part of town in that flabbergasting apparatus. He was wearing a rented tuxedo with a gardenia in his lapel. There was a corsage of 2 orchids for Celia on the seat beside him. Father stripped down to his underwear, and Mother brought him the uniform. She was in on this double cross of Felix. She thought everything Father did was wonderful. And while Father was getting dressed again, she went around turning off electric lights and lighting candles. She and Father, without anybody's much noticing it, had earlier in the day put candles everywhere. There must have been 100 of them. Mother got them all lit, just about the time Father topped off his scarlet and silver uniform with the busby. And I myself, standing on the balcony outside my bedroom on the loft, was as enchanted as Mother and Father expected Celia Hildreth to be. I was inside a great beehive filled with fireflies, and below me was the beautiful king of the early evening. My mind had been trained by heirloom books of fairy tales, and by the myths and legends which animated my father's conversation, to think that way. It was second nature for me, and for Felix too, and for no other children in Midland City, I am sure, to see candle flames as fireflies, and to invent a king of the early evening. And now, the king of the early evening, with a purple plume in his busby, gave this order: "Ope! Ope the portals!" What portals were there to open? There were only 2, I thought. There was the front door on the south, and there was the kitchen door on the northeast. But Father seemed to be calling for something far more majestic than opening both of those. And then he advanced on the 2 huge carriage house doors, in one of which our front door was set. I had never thought of them as doors. They were a wall of my home which was made of wood rather than stone. Now, Father took hold of the mighty bolt which had held them shut for 30 years. It resisted him for only a moment, and then slid back, as it had been born to do. Until that moment, I had seen that bolt as just another dead piece of medieval iron on the wall. In the proper hands, perhaps it could have killed an enemy. I had felt the same way about the ornate hinges, but they weren't more junk from Europe. They were real Midland City, Ohio hinges, ready to work at any time. I had stolen downstairs now, awe in every step I took. The king of the early evening put his shoulder to one carriage house door and then the other. A wall of my home vanished. There were stars and a rising moon where it had been. 8. And Mother and Father and I all hid as Felix arrived, with Celia Hildreth in the Kiedzler touring car. Felix, too, was dazed by the lovely transformation of our home. When he switched off the Kiedzler's idling engine, it was as though it went on idling anyway. In a voice just like the engine's, he was reassuring Celia that she needn't be afraid, even though she had never seen anything like this house before. I heard her say this: "I'm sorry, I can't help being scared. I want to get out of here." I was just inside the great new doorway. That should have been enough for Felix. He should have gotten her out of there. As she would say in a few minutes, she hadn't even wanted to go to the prom, but her parents had told her she had to, and she hated her dress and was ashamed to have anybody see her in it. And she didn't understand rich people and didn't want to. And she was happiest when she was all alone and nobody could stare at her, and nobody could say things to her that she was supposed to reply to in some fancy ladylike way, and so on. Felix used to say that he didn't get her out of there because he wanted to show Father that he could keep a promise, even if Father couldn't. He admits now, though, that he forgot her entirely. He got out of the car, but he didn't go to Celia's side to open the door for her and offer his arm. All alone, he walked to the center of the great new doorway, and he stopped there, and he put his hands on his hips, and he looked all around at the galaxy of tiny conflagrations. He should have been angry, and he would get angry later. He would be like a dog with rabies later on. But at that moment, he could only acknowledge that his father, after years of embarrassing enthusiasms and ornate irrelevancies, had produced an artistic masterpiece. Never before had there been such beauty in Midland City. And then Father stepped out from behind a vertical timber, the very one which had mashed his left foot so long ago. He was only a yard or two from Felix, and he held an apple in his hand. Celia could see him through the windshield of the Kiedzler. He called out, with our house as an echo chamber, "Let Helen of Troy come forward to claim this apple, if she dare." Celia stayed right where she was. She was petrified. And Felix, having allowed things to go this far, was fool enough to think that maybe she could get out of the car and accept the apple, even though there was no way she could have any idea what was going on. What did she know of Helen of Troy and apples? For that matter, what did Father know? He had the legend all garbled, as I now realize. Nobody ever gave Helen of Troy an apple. Not as a prize, anyway. It was the goddess Aphrodite who was given a golden apple in the legend, as a prize for being the most beautiful of all the goddesses. A young prince named Paris, a mortal, chose her over the other two finalists in the contest, Athena and Hera. So, as though it would have made the least bit of difference on that spring night in 1943, Father should have said,
Let Aphrodite come forward to claim this apple, if she dare.
It would have been better still, of course, if he had himself bound and gagged in the gunroom on the night of the senior prom. As for Helen of Troy and how she fitted into the legend, not that Celia Hildreth had ever heard of her, she was the most beautiful mortal woman on earth, and Aphrodite donated her to Paris in exchange for the apple. There was just one trouble with Helen. She was already married to the king of Sparta, so that Paris, a Trojan, had to kidnap her. Thus began the Trojan War. So, Celia got out of the car all right, but she never went to get the apple. As Felix approached her, she tore off her corsage and she kicked off her high-heeled golden dancing shoes, bought, no doubt, like her white dress and maybe her underwear, at prodigious financial sacrifice. And fear and anger and stocking feet and that magnificent face made her as astonishing as anyone I have ever encountered in a legend from any culture. Midland City had a goddess of discord all its own. This was a goddess who could not dance, would not dance, and hated everybody at the high school. She would like to claw away her face, she told us, so that people would stop seeing things in it that had nothing to do with what she was like inside. She was ready to die at any time, she said, because what men and boys thought about her and tried to do to her made her so ashamed. One of the first things she was going to do when she got to heaven, she said, was to ask somebody what was written on her face and why it had been put there. I reconstruct all the things that Celia said that night as Felix and I sit side by side here in Haiti, next to our swimming pool. She said, we both remember, that black people were kinder and knew more about life than white people did. She hated the rich. She said that rich people ought to be shot for living the way we did, with a war going on. And then, leaving her shoes and corsage behind her, she struck out on foot for home. She only had about 14 blocks to go. Felix went after her in the Kienzler, creeping along beside her, begging her to get in. But she ditched him by cutting through a block where the Kienzler couldn't go, and he never found out what happened to her after that. They didn't meet again until 1970, 27 years later. She was then married to Dwayne Hoover, the Pontiac dealer, and Felix had just been fired as president of the National Broadcasting Company. He had come home to find his roots.